Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is part of the ground truth track for BSides Las Vegas. Before we start, we're going to thank our sponsors, our Inner Circle sponsor, Critical Stack, and our stellar sponsors, Amazon, Cylance, Microsoft, as well as volunteers and donors. This talk is by Ben and Wade, and it's called Scratching the Surface of Risk. Other announcements, please silence your phones right now, and we'll pass around the mic at the end so everyone can hear you. Help me in welcoming them, please.
All right, thank you guys. I'm Wade, Ben here. Hopefully we'll get the logistics going. Okay, kind of a double meaning on the title here, Scratching the Surface, meaning we are just going to not go extremely deep into risk, but we're also, you'll see in a minute, we're scratching the surface of the internet a little bit to see what we can find out, and we're going to share some of those findings with you. So I want to give a little background. We are both at the Scientia Institute research firm. You can access other research that we have published from our website. We have a really cool job. I think it's maybe, I don't know, I'm pretty biased. I think it's one of the better jobs in security, but what we do is many of the vendors that you see that we've worked with here will give us an interesting data set, right? And they want to publish something. And they have a marketing goal in publishing this, right? They want to do something to grow thought leadership or increase their visibility in the marketplace, et cetera. But from our perspective, we get really interesting data and we get to scratch on it and see what's there and publish something. So we're going to be talking about two of these things today. Down here in the lower left, some work that we did with Risk Recon, two reports published this year. And so this track is called Ground Truth. And there's, I don't know if this metaphor is going to work, but I'll try it and you guys can call BS if you want. But there is a real sense here in which we're looking for ground truth in what is sometimes kind of a lofty, aspirational marketing. So, case in point, Risk Recon has, as a marketing message, they give a definition for what they have termed the risk surface, okay? And this is their definition. Risk surface refers to anywhere an organization's ability to operate, reputation, assets, legal obligations, regulatory compliance is at risk. Don't ask me to memorize it. I'm just quoting to you from what their messaging says. So again, the model goes, they provide a data set, and our job is to find something interesting about this. They want us to, hey, let's write a report on interesting aspects of the risk surface using this definition. So we get a data set and our job, what can we learn about the risk surface? What features of that surface are in this data set? And what can we report on that people are going to find interesting, right?
So just a quick description of the data set. So by the way, I'm Ben. We didn't really introduce ourselves and who we were.
I did, you were sleeping.
Oh, okay. So both Dr. Baker and I make up the research division at Scientia, and we're really the powerhouse. I'm mostly the brains, and he's the looks. That's why we're here. Yeah, exactly. The brains. That's why I said the brains of the operation. So we take these data sets and we analyze them, and oftentimes what we get is just large dumps of data from the customer, and they say here. And so, for example, for what we're going to talk about today, this is the dump of data that we all got. So 18,000 firms. This is a sample of Risk Recon data. We're looking at 5 million different hosts. And hosts here has a little bit of a squishy definition. It means IP addresses or domains that resolve. And so we have those across 200 different countries, so most of the world. And looking at 40 million security findings. And I'm going to use the word findings instead of vulnerabilities, because this can also be things like misconfigurations or threat intel information. So we have a lot of different stuff here. And so the question is, Wade gave us that definition. How do we go from this to something we can measure and analyze? And we have to do that at the right level. So I don't know how many of you are aware of the infinite coastline paradox. So this is this idea that the coastline of Britain, in all its detail, is actually of infinite length, because if you take a 1 meter stick and you go around the coastline, you're going to get something that's a multiple of a meter. If you go down to the centimeter, you can kind of put that around rocks, and you kind of get higher and higher resolution. And I think a lot of times what we do in security is we start to focus on the rocks and the sand, and we're looking at risk at that kind of vulnerability level. Like, do I have my snort rule? Are these CVEs patched? Right? And we're not looking at the whole picture of risk. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we don't want to kind of get too high up. We don't want to get to 30,000 feet and get just kind of this box, right? So we want to get the right level of granularity to how we're going to look at risk and look at our data. So we want kind of this end picture where we get the general shape, we get Wales, we get Scotland, we get the Orkneys up there, but we don't necessarily need to know every detail of that coastline. And we want the same thing for risk. So what we did is we operationalized this into 5 different kind of things that we can actually measure. And we're going to talk about all 5. And we're going to learn a little bit about each of those, and then we're drawing some insights, and we're going to ask some questions that might actually be interesting. So first of all, just how many internet-facing hosts does an organization have? What's out there? What can you hit from the outside? Where are those things hosted? Who has the infrastructure? And I'm not saying geographically, but this is who's the provider. Then the next, of course, is geography. So this goes into that compliance and regulation, like what laws do you have to abide by in your location? Value, this is a tough one to define, and I will be happily talking about this for a while, but we're going to gloss over it a little bit today, because value is a really hard thing to define. And then last, the one that everybody's here at summer camp this weekend to learn about is like all the flaws, right? Like how can we break this stuff? So we're going to break these down into these 5 categories, and these all seem like simple things for an organization that we can measure. But I want to talk about a little bit. Am I talking about this, or are you talking about this?
I'll talk about this.
Okay.
You've been talking long enough. So let's take one organization. What you're looking at here is not an incredibly pretty picture of, I don't know, what was it, 3,500-ish hosts or something like that? It's an organization with about 3,500 hosts, and this is, if you just threw them all in the same lump, what your, quote, risk surface would look like, right? You know nothing else except number of hosts. Obviously, not incredibly intuitive, right? You're not going to learn much about managing risk at that layer. But you can begin to break it up. This has it broken up by external providers. So every cluster is a hosting provider that has some of your assets in their environment, right? Okay, maybe that's a little bit more intuitive. We have some more features, et cetera. We can add another layer. It's kind of hard to tell what changed here, but some of the dots got bigger. And this is essentially a measure of asset criticality or value, as Ben said. It's a little bit squishy because Risk Recon is doing some things like, what is this host doing? Are they receiving information, or is it just a static host? Does it look like they're handling sensitive information or have critical functions, et cetera? But the basic gist is the higher level functionality, more critical functions, higher value. So it's at least a feature we want to study and see if it tells us something interesting. And we can also begin breaking this up by geography, so it starts to get more and more complex because in a certain region, now all of a sudden we've got 3 or 4 or 5 different providers in that region, and over here we might have the same provider, but they're in different countries, might be subject to different laws. And we go back to that definition of risk surface, which is, you could have the same hosting provider in different countries, and those data centers are subject to different regulations, right? So all of this is supposed to be informing risk. And then here are findings that are determined to be most severe, and blue, I believe, is the least. So, you look at this, and you've gone from that one just sort of homogeneous circle of 3,500 hosts to where I know nothing is labeled here because we don't want to get into that level of detail right now, but you could conceivably find, well, okay, which hosting provider in which region has my most critical exposures and my high value assets, and maybe I need to focus there and see what's going on with that hosting provider and ask them to get their act together, or pull my hosts out of there and put them somewhere else, et cetera, right? You can start making some decisions about this because we've got a better view of the risk surface.
And so why this view is important. So when we were looking at that previous organization, that's essentially like one of two. So if we think about, these are two similar organizations in a lot of metrics. They have about the same number of hosts, about 1,300. They're both based in the United States. They're both retailers. They have roughly the same revenue every year. And so what we want to understand is, given like a failure within the organization, so a data breach, say at the internal level or with your cloud provider, somebody loses some credentials, how many of your assets are at risk? Like how big a lateral movement can somebody make potentially? So for one organization, so even though these are largely similar, for this orange organization, we can lose up to like 90%. You could lose 90% capacity with just kind of one failure. It's really centralized. Whereas, and we notice we're on a log scale, we go 1, 10, 100. This blue organization, we lose maybe 60% capacity. So this idea that we have several aspects of risk here, because blue is more diverse for this kind of one type of failure that we might hypothesize, it's going to be more resilient. And so we want to understand those kind of curves and surfaces and how they interact with different threats to be able to understand where risk is. So we can take that and what we're going to do is we're going to make a 5-dimensional risk surface, and it's going to have those things in it: the hosts, providers, geography, value, and findings. So, yeah, I remembered all of them. That's pretty good. I mean, it's late, right? Like, come on. I know there's the rest of the week. So let's talk about hosts first. So on the horizontal axis here, it's just all the percentage of those 18,000 organizations, and the vertical axis is the percentage of hosts they have. And notice we have like this strong linear correlation, of course. The more organizations that are sampled, the more hosts they're going to account for based on industry. But I mean, there's some obvious things like information, like technology. Those guys are going to be above the line, right? They're going to account for more of them. Things like healthcare, this is kind of going to be below. And then what we also can just look at that number of hosts as a distribution. Most people have 10 or a dozen. Most organizations have this many internet-facing hosts. But I'm going to use the pointer so I don't cross the line. Some have like hundreds of thousands of hosts, right? So we have to deal with this like large spread in at least one of the dimensions of risk. Am I going to keep going? Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I like this one. I like this one. So we can also kind of look at these demographic things. So the number of employees on the horizontal and annual revenue on the vertical. And what we notice, of course, there's going to be a strong correlation here, but we can also color by the number of hosts. And we start to see some really interesting things. So for example, we have an organization, let's say here, which has like 20,000 employees, $10 million, and they have less than 10 hosts, right? So no external presence, but tons and tons of revenue employees. And we can kind of pick out some of these interesting variations when we do visualizations like that and start to look at risk surface at this level.
Sure, keep going, man. You're doing well.
So we can talk about external hosting. So what we did was we mapped individual hosts to whoever owned the infrastructure. And this is just a list of providers. We're going to talk about cloud providers later, which is going to be slightly different. What we notice, of course, is like Amazon sort of owns the internet, right? Right. It's actually, if you're running externally, they account for 27% of our external hosts. Akamai and doing some content delivery network stuff, that's next. And then interesting, like this one was an interesting one for me. It's a corporation services company because I didn't know much about them. But they largely run hosting and infrastructure for, we've been talking for 10 minutes. Is that what that sign means?
10 minutes per meeting.
Oh, I thought we were going until 7.
No, this should be an hour.
It's an hour.
Okay. You scared me. I was like, Jesus, I got like 75 more slides to go. So let's talk. So a corporation services company, they run hosting, DNS, email. They provide these tech services for organizations who don't want to and shouldn't, right? That's not their core competency. They're going to do that. And so we can also look at things like how many of, say, cloud providers does an organization have, right? And so I'm going to explain these charts because we're going to talk about them a lot. These gray bars, 2/3 of firms lie within this range. and then the median or mean or whatever measure of central tendency is correct is going to be the blue dot. So if all you care about is average, just look at the blue dots. But if you want to know a little bit about the variation, that's what the gray bar is in these interval charts. So interesting things here, information. These are the guys who have a lot of hosts out in the cloud. So if you're a tech company, you're probably not doing all your own hosting. You're going to somebody else. But of course, there are some companies that I assume the ones who are actually providers are going to host their own stuff, right? So we get a lot of variation in information. And there's something like finance way down here that keeps things close, and there's not a lot of variation among them.
I find it interesting. There's more variation, within an industry than across industries.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we're going from what 14% here to 20%, but for information, we're all the way up to nearly 70.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, ask questions. I'm happy to answer. We should make this interactive. It's late in the day. I know some of you have been drinking.
Go back to the last slide.
Yeah.
On the green chart at the bottom,
Yeah.
is that 2% really longer than the 1%?
Is this?
Is that 2% longer than
I'm rounding here, asshole. So yes. Yes.
Why is that 2% bigger than the
Yeah.
other 2%?
0.8, 2.2.
My 2% is swimming.
Yeah. I'm going to let you talk about geography.
Okay.
I've been talking for a while.
So again, another dimension, we were interested in the number of countries in which organizations work. Now this is kind of weird because you have regions on the left here and then host countries per organization. So reading this correctly, it is organizations in Western Europe on average host assets in about 7.4 other countries, right? And on the other end of the spectrum in Central Asia, a much lower, around 2 other countries. Again, gray bars, lots of variation among that. But this is kind of weird. Again, I don't know what this informs you about risk, but it could be, Western Europe. You've got very, they want free trade. You've got a lot of things that make it easy to do business. So you're going to tend to do business in more countries, right? Whereas that's not necessarily the case all over. And if you are opening offices and other things like that, okay, North America, is less. And it may be because there's a lot of hosting providers in North America, right. So you don't necessarily have to go out of band to host your assets. So lots of things tied into this, but it's sort of an interesting view of other places. Again, if it's 7 versus 2, potentially impacted by lots of different other regulations. Yes, sir.
Considering that some of the hosting providers, Amazon, Azure, Google, name 3, I guess I can count still, are geographically dispersed themselves.
Yes.
Right.
You could use a hosting provider that's headquartered in North America, but still have geographical diversity.
Correct.
Were you able to account for that in this chart? And if not, perhaps our view into geographic diversity isn't as illuminating as we'd like.
So the answer is yes, but only to as good of resolution as geolocation services for IPs are anyway. So services like MaxMind, which I think Risk Recon uses several different services, but given this IP or this IP address that a domain resolves to, we think that's located in this country. So like MaxMind claims that they can get you within a city block. I don't know if that's true, but that's where the actual location of the host we get that data.
And this accounts for hosted or offline because they're spun up for in the event of disaster.
So you're saying like if they like fall back to another.
I know for certain that in my case that we've got hosts that are offline right now in the other continents.
Oh.
I mean, yes. I mean, if it's offline, it's largely not in the sample anyway.
Right? Yeah, but they're available to be on.
Yeah.
And so could be
That's a good point.
So that's a very common strategy in the use of these larger hosting providers.
Sure. And yeah, that's a caveat here is that we're looking at, for most of this data, a snapshot that occurred over the course of I
can't remember what the time frame was.
And so, yes, a lot of this is dynamic, and in fact, future work will be looking at how these things change over time. But yeah, certainly there could be hosts that we've never seen before, and then they come up at another time and disappear. And things we'll never see, right? You start the scan, it's nothing there, and it comes up after your scanner leaves, and yeah.
And all of this is only internet-facing hosts, so nothing internal would show up.
So, and I'm going to challenge you to say, like, yes, those kind of details that's looking at the rocks on the coastline, right? So we can get a pretty fair picture of an organization based on what they have online, like at any given time. And that's going to be maybe not static, but within a distribution over time.
Yeah, you're going to display our entirety of the PR strategy,
Yeah.
which informs tremendously about the maturity of an organization, et cetera. So this is one of those areas where being able to look at the grains of sand is actually sometimes necessary.
Yeah,
to understand
Yeah.
the risk posture of an organization, especially if you want to understand, do they have VR capabilities and how are those available?
Yeah, and certainly that kind of dive is worthy of research. But we're trying to get that maybe not 30,000 foot picture, but top of the hill, right?
Yeah,
We're just scratching the surface.
Just scratch the surface.
and maybe those other, I'm one of the projects in the room.
We're also going to have a Q&A at the end, so maybe we could leave the questions.
Oh, right, and there's a
I did
microphone.
see a question back there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we can
Sorry,
repeat
just
them as
because
well.
his hand was up for a while, I felt bad.
Cool. So less a question than a comment. MaxMind, they're using ASNs as kind of how they do geolocation as the primary key, and you can get an IP assigned out of any ASN and run it anywhere in the world. So, usually there is some correlation, but it is not one-to-one.
Absolutely.
And there, especially if companies are using VPNs, that it really can distort your picture.
Yeah.
So, this is certainly like a good, I would say top of the hill look. If there are data points from here that are interesting to individual companies, then they're going to need to look a little bit deeper.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Let's skip that one.
Yep.
Go here.
Oh, yeah. This is my favorite chart. So because you're in the ground truth track, I'm going to assume you're interested in novel and weird visualizations. So this is a novel and weird visualization that I made. This is called a ternary chart. And I'm going to do it really quickly. If you'd like to know more, I have a blog post. Go to the Scientia website, and you can read more about how to read these. But these work for a certain type of three-dimensional data. And what I mean by three-dimensional data is you have 3 float numbers that you're going to try to visualize. So rather than a scatter plot where you have 2, we're going to have 3. But those 3 numbers have to add up to 1. Okay? So this allows us to see kind of the relative proportions in one chart in 2 dimensions. And so basically, down here in the lower left is one dimension. What we're going to look at is value. So in an organization, what percentage of hosts are low, medium, high values? Those are my 3 dimensions. And notice they all add up to 1 because we're going to be exclusive with those values. So down here in the lower left, this is the organizations that only have low value hosts. And then over here on the right, only high value, and up here at the top, only medium value. And so the density here, the color, is roughly like how many out of all organizations lie in that kind of little hex grid that it lands in. So the way that you read this is the same way you read a scatter plot, where you kind of go across and you go here, and then that point where those 2 lines intersect, that's the data. We're going to do the same thing, except we're going to draw 3 lines. So if we have an organization that is 50% low, we're going to go down at a 60-degree angle. 33% high, we're going to go up at a 60-degree angle from here, and then across at medium, and we're going to get to this point. And this is 33% high, 50% low, and 17% medium. So the point here is not necessarily for you to pick out these individual points, but the idea is that most organizations are low and medium with a little bit of high, but they tend to be down here. There are some organizations that are exclusively medium value, high value, or low value. And so this is kind of an interesting way to break up 3 things and look at them. we can look at a more traditional way and do breakdowns across different industries and just examine on the total for that industry what's the breakdown of value. So public administration, they have a crazy amount of internet-facing hosts that we would consider high value. Hospitality, this is an interesting one for me because we think of these people as having critical infrastructure, websites, reservations, things like that. Not high value that's publicly facing. So.
Can you talk a little bit more about the real estate line, just to help us understand what would be high value in real estate?
So you know NAICS, and you know there's some weirdness in how they do that.
Yeah.
So there's like brokerages and other kinds of things in the real estate sector that,
Yep. So we've talked about three things, hosting, value, and location. And what we might want to do is look at how this breaks down across those three things. So this is a flow diagram. For all of our data, we have mostly low and medium, about 20% of that being high. And then we can kind of further break those down based on whether they're internally, externally hosted, and foreign and domestic. So some things, for low value hosts, people farm that out. Like if I'm putting up a static web page, I will let somebody else host it. I don't need to. And then there's kind of equal, like you might have your home page in your home country, and then wherever else you operate, you might have it other hosted. High value assets are, interestingly, it's kind of more of an even split, although not entirely. And then those break down further across foreign and domestic. So is there anything else fun to point out, Wade? Yes, curmudgeon number one.
Are the domestic relative to what? To the organization?
Foreign, the question is foreign and domestic relative to what? The organization's home base versus the
where the host is.
where the host is. Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. Security findings. So this is arguably the most interesting aspect of all of this, maybe the most risk relevant aspect of this. And this is, again, not a whole lot of information in this one, but the median number of security or percentage of hosts that have, is this higher critical? I forget.
This is higher critical.
Higher critical. We kind of ignored lows and that kind of thing because it wasn't as interesting. So about 1% of hosts have a higher critical finding. And what would you do with that information? I don't know, but you can slice it up in different ways. Hey, research question, is that higher or lower in larger and smaller organizations? If you look at this, bottom of the chart, generally a higher percentage of hosts have higher critical findings in smaller organizations than in larger organizations. Now you could read that several ways. You could say, well, of course, because smaller organizations have all kinds of security issues and they can't get their stuff together, and you could weave a story around that. But you could also just say, hey, the law of large numbers is at play here, and larger organizations have a lot more hosts, and therefore a smaller proportion of those hosts have higher critical findings. Yes?
Higher critical findings.
Yeah.
If we could just leave all the questions towards the end,
All right,
because the
all right.
live stream
Sorry.
can't hear unless we actually put it through the mic.
Okay. Well, they should have bought a ticket and been here. No, I'm just kidding, guys. Just kidding. Just kidding. We're glad you're listening in. Thank you. So I'll take the question. Question was asked about how do we know it's higher critical findings? We don't.
Right.
Again, this data set is provided to us, and some of these things are pre-labeled. Anytime we work with a client, we try to understand, well, how did you get this? And Risk Recon's answer, there's some automatic ratings, there's some lookups to, what CVSS scores essentially amount to and things like that. So I am not telling you that this is true on all of these. Everybody in this room would agree, oh yeah, that one's higher than that one's critical, that one's high.
Right.
But again, we're looking really big picture here overall. We're trying to weed out the just noise that isn't really an issue versus the stuff that, hey, you might actually care about these findings, right, is the point of this. And I think it's pretty good at that level for that goal. Right. So, interesting little stat, 56% of firms have a higher critical security finding in an internet-facing host, over half. This is a kind of a neat little view. I can't go on that side. So on the top, if you almost want to visually put a line here. These are firms with hosts on premises and firms with hosts and external providers. So as we did this, we kept going back to this notion of, hey, I wonder if the rate of security findings is higher on on-prem assets versus hosted on third-party networks, right? Because a lot of us worry about that, right? Do I want to keep my valuable assets really close to my chest so I can protect them better, or does somebody else do a better job at that? And that question is, you'll see, is kind of depends. But let's just go over here. Firms with severe findings and high value assets with hosts on premises, about 8% of firms have higher critical findings in on-prem assets. 25% of firms have higher critical findings in assets and external providers. So you could read that. The rate of higher critical findings is 3 times in external hosting providers than on-prem.
Among organizations.
Among organizations, sorry. Yeah, not number of hosts, the proportion of firms that have those.
Right.
So I think you want to do this little sequence.
So we've talked about 5 different things, and I'm going to put up 5 interval charts. I know these are small, but I'm going to tell you that the numbers are not critical. It's what I'm going to do with these charts. So we looked at number of hosts, number of providers, host countries per organization, percentage of high-value hosts, and hosts with higher critical findings. And this is all revenue, right? So we're going to look at kind of revenue size of the company as the size of the company for a proxy. So the question now becomes, can we get a better, more unified view than a giant set of interval charts? And the idea is let's look at just the 10 million to 100 million. So isolate this bar and stick with me. Arrange it in kind of a star shape. And we'll take these middle points and we're going to say, what happens if we make this a radar chart? And so the idea here is not to actually be able to extract that variation. It's not to be able to dive deep and get that kind of sand look at risk, but it's to kind of get the outline of what's happening here, right? So for organizations with $10 million to $100 million of revenue, they tend to have a lot of findings. A lot of high-value hosts are out there. Not a ton of geography or providers and kind of middling hosts. And what we can do is we boiled these 5 charts down to, for each line here, we need 1. And then we can kind of look at how this evolves over as revenue evolves. So if we have really small organizations, not very much revenue, again, not a lot of presence, and nicely, not a ton of findings, not a high percentage of findings for those, on average, right? On average. But a lot of high-value hosts out there. And then as you notice, because as we increase, their hosts, their providers, their geography kind of starts to expand, more and more findings, especially in this middle range. They're kind of out here on the edge. And then those findings, as you get larger and larger organizations, you start to hide your high-value assets, and your findings kind of shrink. You get better at managing what's out there. And so this gives us an idea of, say, how risk evolves as the company revenue evolves. All right, everybody likes it. So we can do the same thing. We can break it down by industry. There's some really interesting things here. Education, I would say, we could even say this is a huge risk surface. And anybody who's ever worked at a university, I think would agree with this, right? You've got balkanized networks and people running their own stuff and unmanaged things. And then you have, finance, low findings, kind of not huge spread on the other dimensions. They kind of run a tight ship. And we'd expect that from banks and financial services organizations. Anything else you like on this one?
One of the things we were interested in, and again, I don't think this is perfect. It's just trying to see generalities. And we've already shown you that the variation among industries is super huge. So I'm surprised there's any difference in shape in some of these things, to be honest with you. Yeah. But one of the things I want to dig into in the future is, does the shape matter? Is there some reason that healthcare and hospitality are similar-ish, right? Or is that, maybe it's just random noise, but maybe it's similar types of assets, similar business models, similar approaches to managing IT, might result in different shapes here. All right, so that was all very exploratory. Again, here's this definition. What kind of dimensions can you measure? Let's do some visualization, see what comes out. This is more of a traditional, we had a research question. We want to know, is the cloud safer or more secure than on-prem, right? A lot of people want to know this question. You hear it a lot. And how can we use this data set to offer up evidence for one of these positions or the other? So first of all, let's back up a second and just marvel at the amount of consolidation in the cloud space.
So by the way, this is the percentage of everything that's not hosted on-prem.
Yeah, we probably should have done this as a percentage of cloud hosted hosts. But anyway, the point is, by the time you get out of the top 10 cloud providers, the percentage of hosts is really small, right? And this is the top 20, and this is almost everything.
Yeah.
Right. The list is a whole lot longer, but the numbers are astonishingly small. If you look at that by industry, we just take the top cloud providers from the beginning there, which have a large majority of the hosts. And we look at, well, okay, information sector, manufacturing sector, which cloud providers do they use? Amazon eats over half of them, no matter what the industry is. And we'll show you in a minute. That's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. But then certain industries stick out. Like, why does the manufacturing sector have sort of an appeal for rack space more so than others? And things pop out like that you kind of want to trace. And professional services, Microsoft. You have anything else you want to call out on that one?
No, I just, like accounting firms and you're
good point.
You're running
using Office 365, et cetera. So you could stare at this. It's kind of weird and interesting. Amazon doesn't win everywhere, however. So across the top here, you have different regions. And these are the top clouds out of that list we just showed you in each region. And there's some fluctuation around. Amazon is top in a lot of different places, not everywhere. And then you get beyond that, you have a lot of hopping around. So overall, firms are twice as likely to have severe exposures in cloud assets. Okay, just think about that chart we showed you a while ago where we did all external facing hosts and internal, and it was like 3x. This is just in cloud, so you could say, well, when we look at cloud-based hosts, there's less discrepancy with on-prem than all external hosted assets. But let's look at this a different way. You want to take this one?
Sure. So, but that's not true for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? So we boiled this down to a single number, but that's not going to be true for all organizations. So what we have here, each point here is an organization. On the horizontal axis is the number of on-premises hosts with the higher critical findings. And the vertical axis is the percentage of cloud hosts with higher critical findings. So if you're green, on-prem is safer, and if you're blue, the cloud is safer. And actually what we end up having is about a 60-40 split. So for about 60% of organizations, they do better on-prem, and 40% do better in the cloud. And so we might ask, why? So why is there this difference? So one thing we wanted to look at is kind of maybe a more complex view than those radar charts. I don't even know what to call this.
We called them surface plots.
We called them
Something
surface
like that.
plots by the
know.
end of it. But what we want to do is kind of look at these three aspects and kind of, I think actually we have four here, and try to understand what's going on. So this is every host in our data set. We have the asset value on the horizontal, and whether it's internally hosted or cloud on the vertical. And then each square is sized proportional to how many hosts fall in that category. So almost like the most are internally hosted medium value. Lowest is the high, that's the small square. And then it's colored by the number of higher critical findings. So the general thing that you'll notice here is that there are a higher percentage of hosts with higher critical findings that are high value value. And that's not to say like people are bad at protecting those. It's likely that those are more complex things that are harder to protect. Right? You're running more software. They're doing more critical tasks. It's more likely that they're going to have problems. Low value assets, we pointed this out before, more likely to be hosted in the cloud. High value assets, the square is different. So we can kind of do that same breakout across industries and kind of get a different view than that radar chart and dig a little deeper. So there are some interesting things here. So for example, hospitality just really loves the cloud, right? They don't like to host internally. And most of their problems happen on cloud hosted things. Whereas education down here, almost everything that's bad is happening for high value is happening internally, which again is sort of interesting. But that general trend goes across where you have higher value or higher critical findings in high value assets across the board. But this gives us another way to kind of look at that variation across industry or organization or whatever we'd like. So given that, let's re-ask our question, are you safer on-prem or in the cloud? And we can ask on a kind of per industry basis, because maybe that's what that separation is it's an industry-based thing. And so what we did is we built, this is actually modeling, this is not data. We built some logistic regression models just to identify, like, is this host going to have a higher critical finding? And we can build them separately across industries. So education is the only one that benefits from being in the cloud. So this is on-prem, top clouds, right? And it's actually like, it's still up
Overall.
here. Overall. It's still higher than everybody else, but they're probably safer. And it's because maybe those clouds have tools that help secure those hosts that are not being used internally. So there's a bunch where there's actually no difference. And when I say no difference, I mean no statistical difference between whether you're on-prem or in the cloud. So public administration, energy, real estate, yes, there is some variation. Like some organizations are better in one way or another. But on balance, there's no difference here. And then for everybody else, you're better on-prem, at least for these sets of organizations, right? And those are statistically significant slopes. We can cut this different ways. More money, different problems. So we can look across revenue, and again, these lines are the results of models that we built to try to pull apart these differences. So if we look at the likelihood that you're going to have a higher critical finding in a cloud, that's this blue line, and then on-prem is the green line. So we notice, like, early on, where we might not have a ton of data, you're better off on-prem, okay? So if you're a small organization, you're less likely to have those findings on-prem. In the middle area, you should be in the cloud. And then towards the end, again, we kind of see maybe these larger organizations get better at handling things internally. Yeah. We thought this one was sort of interesting. Do you want to
I'll do it.
All right.
Thanks for giving me a chance, man.
No, I just like to talk. Sound of my own voice.
On the bottom here, you have the number of cloud providers that an organization has hosts with, and then the percentage of those hosts with higher critical findings. And what this is showing, if you have the rate of severe findings is highest when you have one cloud provider, and it drops the more cloud providers you get till about 8, and then it kind of levels out and look at the number of dots out here, and I wouldn't trust like, ooh, it rockets back up again or anything like that. It just, but the behavior here is
Wade's saying he doesn't trust my modeling.
right. The behavior here is kind of interesting because you think, oh, I decrease findings just by having more cloud providers. What's going on there? My hypothesis, which I can't really prove right now, is that we've got kind of a maturity thing going here. Like these organizations, they just were experimenting and they spun up a host, did some stuff, forgot about it for a while. They're not, quote, serious about the cloud, whereas maybe these are more mature. They probably have a cloud security program, and so you get less hosts. I don't know. Maybe that's not the case, but that's my hypothesis of what's going on, because it doesn't make sense to me that just by having a bunch of cloud providers, you drop your findings, right? Spread the risk.
Spread the risk.
True.
And also potentially you get better at this idea of like, I'm going to put some of my infrastructure in the cloud. I've managed this on AWS. Hey, Azure isn't that different. IBM Cloud isn't that different. And I understand the benefits of the cloud, and I'm willing to use those tools to secure it as you get more and more.
Yeah.
And if I'm willing to spread out to a bunch of different clouds, I may be picking them based on like what they're good at, too. So I might be going somebody for specific types of database, some people for other types of hosting. Yeah.
All right, we're almost done here. Another thing we wanted to ask is, okay, that was cloud overall. Is there a difference among clouds? Actually, let's just go to this one. This is number of findings per host in different clouds, okay? If you can count the number of severe higher critical findings on your hosts. So we redacted some names here to protect the not so innocent. No, just. But the interesting thing here is, the green internal bar actually has a much higher rate of findings than the top clouds right down at the bottom there with the lowest rate. Not always the case, of course. This one is another interesting view. If you look at this and say percent of hosts with higher critical findings instead of number of findings per host, which was the last chart, you get something like this. Whereas for internal hosts, it's a severe finding rate of 1.6. Amazon does better than that. Microsoft does better than that. And if you remember, those are the top two in terms of sheer volume of hosts that are hosted. So this is actually a good thing that the cloud providers that host the largest proportion of hosts actually have the cleanest security record. I view that as that's good. I'm glad they're not way up there at the 14.4%, which we'll leave unnamed, which is a cloud provider with a much higher rate of findings. So woven into this, of course, you could argue, oh, well, Amazon and Microsoft are probably business use case, and those organizations know how to secure them, and maybe the rate is so much higher on some of those at the top because they're more casual or not as critical assets or something like that. Or maybe they're just not secure environments, or maybe Amazon offers better tools to secure your host. There's lots of different stuff going on here that we don't know the answer to, that we'll be digging into in the future. But just the difference in volume here of the high and severe finding rate, I think is very interesting among the cloud providers. Let's just skip that one.
All right.
Questions? Do we have time? I mean, we have time? Yeah, cool. You want to sum up that?
Sure. So I originally just titled this slide like, so fucking what? Because we asked a lot of questions, we did a lot of description, but you might be like, what am I supposed to do? So one thing I want to talk about is we talked about that analogy at the beginning. I want you to like see the whole country. So try to look at your organization like holistically, and don't get too focused on like individual things and like what vendor I have installed and what CVEs I'm patching. And like we think this is a good approach, and like we're doing it on kind of I don't want to say global, but 18,000 firm, but a scale. But you guys, everybody can do it within their own organization. You should like question everything you know and answer those questions with data. So really try to dig into operationalizing and measuring things that you care about when you ask those questions, like what's better on cloud or on-prem, or in cloud or on-prem, and try to like answer it with like analysis and data. And then last, I would say also like data is not destiny. So like everything we presented here, if you're in a university and I ragged on you too hard, like I'm sorry, but know that doesn't have to be this. This is what statisticians call the ecological fallacy, right? Just because you're a member of a population doesn't mean you have the traits of that population. And so you can actually do better than what we've presented here. And you have action, you have agency to be able to do those things. So we're going to continue doing this with Risk Recon and with other partners, this large-scale, analysis, and we'd love to hear what you think. Not that we haven't already.
If you have questions, just raise your hand. I'll come over.
Yeah, I've got
two questions. The first is, for vulnerabilities, was the distribution of number of hosts with a given number of vulnerabilities. So, 1% of hosts had 99% vulnerabilities, 2% had blah, blah, that kind of thing. Was that long-tailed when you averaged out across organizations, or was it some other kind of distribution?
I'm trying to think if we looked at that.
I know I made that chart at one point. And yes, with a lot of this, the answer is yes, it was long-tailed, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there were hosts that had thousands of findings, and we saw, like, on average, it's like 4, right? But, average is probably bad when you have that long tail, so, yeah.
Okay, and the second one from the
One
stream.
caveat, one caveat with that other question is actually for higher critical findings, it's not that heavy-tailed. So most hosts have a few higher critical, but it's when we have those kind of lower, medium findings that's when we get heavy-tailed. That's right, I did look at that.
And so from the stream, are you passionate about horses or antivirus?
I know exactly who that came from, and it came from a jackass. So related to a horse, bad pivot.
So I think my take-home thing to think about from the conference this week is traditionally we've always focused on hosts and vulnerabilities on host and persistence and all this stuff, and it's all host. It's like, okay, what about serverless? Like, what if all your shit is Lambda? And how does that even show up in this data?
Right now, I would argue it doesn't, right? And when you spin up a function, like, I don't even know, like, how to talk about that. I guess the promise of serverless 2 is it's less vulnerable to attack because it only runs when it has to, and it does a very, very small thing. I don't know. That's like an interesting question for us to.
So I'll give you, like, this year I learned Lambda. I wrote some Python stuff, and I had some surprises along the way. And basically what they do for Lambda is they spin up a container, they call your function, but that container persists as long as it's getting function calls. And there's no memory separation. So, like, if you define a global in Python, the next call has the same data in the global.
Sure.
So that's a totally different, attack surface, right? Because now you might leak PII from one Lambda to another.
One Lambda call to it. Yeah, sure. If you can get it to respond, if you don't clean your input and get it to respond.
Right. But if these guys are just looking at hosts, looking at IPs, it's not going to be one organization.
No, that's as people move to different types of infrastructure, this type of analysis will have to change. I certainly don't think that we're going to stop having static websites and email services and DNS and web apps and database backends and all the stuff that this touches anytime soon. But as that evolves, certainly this type of analysis will have to evolve. Yeah.
And to give some credit to this data. To give some credit to this data, even if you are running a Lambda or an AWS or an Azure Functions type of thing there, what this data is focused on are things that are internet accessible, and to do that, there has to be some IP address or host name that can be reached from the outside. So you may have a whole serverless function, but that eventually needs to be exposed via an API, domain name, et cetera, to the outside. So while this is not going to capture the true complexity that's going on behind the scenes, this has a decent chance of grabbing at least the existence of those functions. There's undoubtedly so much more work to be done on serverless architecture. So,
David Seversky, everybody, he's helping me out. He's my coworker, saving me, answering my questions for me.
Who says that days are useless?
One area that I would have loved to have seen more information on regarding especially the vulnerabilities is whether or not they took a look at things like APIs and within applications, or are we just looking at layer 6 and down, and do we ever look at layer 7? And,
almost certain.
and that would be very informative here.
So this is actually why, I think we probably used the term vulnerability a little bit, but what we really should have been saying is finding, right? So they have categorized a wide variety of things they look at that could spell trouble for an organization, and across the stack.
Yeah, and we mentioned the reports that are published here. I don't think we show anything about the type of findings.
Do
right?
not, because we like started and we're like, there is so much here. We got to do.
So
we got to
that's
do this
coming up.
We got to do this descriptive stuff first, and then we'll kind of like try to pull out, who's got what. Yeah.
Any other questions?
What's Scientia?
Well, we got one more in the back, and then I will answer that.
Hi, thanks again for the talk. From a business/management perspective, what should you be looking at to decide on-prem versus cloud?
The best advice that I think we can give now is goals and capabilities. I mean, because what I would like to do is say, oh, we studied all of these different characteristics about these different organizations, and here are the characteristics that make you more susceptible to cloud issues or on-prem. We couldn't do that. We don't have that data right now. I hope to get there someday. So now I have more of a generic recommendation, and that is aligned with, we see some evidence, I think, that hints at that your capability to move into cloud environments has a lot to do with whether or not you're going to be successful there. And so an honest evaluation of that is probably recommendation number one, at least from my perspective. Don't have the attitude of, oh, just put it up there because cloud is more secure, or I'm going to leave it on-prem and it's magically more secure than if I had gone to the cloud. I mean, I don't think that's true, and I think that sort of 60-40 split is indicative of you're not guaranteed either way. It has a lot to do with capability in different circumstances than what we're looking at in the data at this point.
Any other questions?
I heard a question about what is Scientia. It is the Latin word for science or knowledge, and we cyberized it by putting CY in front of it, because that's what cool cybersecurity companies do.
All right, help me in thanking our speakers, please.
Thank you, guys.